Ok, e soprattutto devo portare il saluto di Roma 3, del nostro direttore di dipartimento, perché noi abbiamo una convenzione da subito con Roma 3, questa alta scuola di specializzazione in sociologia della religione. Quindi benvenuti anche a nome del nostro dipartimento. Non dico altro perché abbiamo già perso molto tempo e poi abbiamo il piacere di avere la relazione della professoressa Davis. Passo la parola a Roberto, che è l'ideatore di tutto questo.
Grazie. Il traguardo è raggiunto, nel senso che la SAFSOR comincia. Mi lascio immaginare quanti ostacoli abbiamo dovuto superare, però credo che a mano che si va avanti si sia in grado anche di porre rimedio ad alcune deficienze, ad alcune carenze. Allora, cominciamo nel 17, che per me è un anno fatidico, infatti l'anno del mio infarto per cose del genere, esattamente. Che devo fare? L'iniziativa è cresciuta perché inizialmente si trattava solo della Università Roma 3 e dell'International Center for the Sociology of Religion. Poi dopo si sono aggiunti l'Istituto Sturzo, che ci ospita, e l'Istituto di Studi Politici San Pio V. E a nome del presidente dell'Istituto Sturzo, il professor Nicola Antonetti, e del professor Paolo De Nardis, che è il presidente dell'Istituto San Pio V, porto il loro saluto. Entrambi sono franco, non ho bisogno di usare frasi come dire, abituali, motivi istituzionali, impegni precedentemente assunti. No, hanno qualche problema di salute entrambi e quindi evidentemente non possono essere sempre e comunque presenti. Ciò detto, voglio sottolineare il fatto che una iniziativa di questo genere ha diversi obiettivi. Un primo obiettivo è quello di offrire a studiosi più o meno giovani, che comunque coltivano la sociologia della religione, di entrare in contatto con gli esponenti più significativi non solo in Italia ma anche all'estero. Allora, prendiamo il caso di oggi, Grace Davie, universalmente conosciuta per un'espressione quale quella del believing without belong, o viceversa belong without believing, che è poi la versione più corrente, ma lei ormai usa tutte e due, anzi non sa quale delle due, una volta mi ha detto, metterà sulla sua tomba, perché ormai non è Grace Davie sociologa, è Grace Davie belonging without believing, che è l'espressione più ricorrente. E quindi, dicevo, l'incontro fisico, personale, proprio a diretta stretta di mano, non da remoto. Ed è per questo che un'iniziativa di questo genere non si fa da remoto. Noi avremmo avuto senz'altro un grande successo con centinaia e centinaia di partecipanti da remoto, data la qualità dell'offerta. Abbiamo preferito mantenere il livello della partecipazione diretta, che si estrinseca soprattutto nei momenti conviviali, lo stare insieme a cena, lo stare insieme a pranzo, prendersi un caffè ad un bar qui nei dintorni. Sono momenti topici, fondamentali. Anni fa è stata pubblicata su Science una ricerca dalla quale risultava che i migliori prodotti scientifici nascono non nei laboratori, nelle caffetterie. Nelle caffetterie. Brevetti, scoperte, ritrovati, nuovi medicinali, perché dialogando con i colleghi vengono fuori delle idee, e dialogando al di fuori, come dire, dell'apparato, al di fuori degli schematismi, al di fuori dei timori di valutazioni pre o durante l'effettuazione di un concorso. C'è un altro obiettivo che questa iniziativa vuole perseguire: sprovincializzare il contesto italiano, inserirlo sempre più in un ambito internazionale. Ed è per questo che noi non ci accontentiamo, per esempio, del grande importante relatore che inaugura la manifestazione, ma abbiamo altre presenze internazionali. Vincenzo Cicchelli, che è di origine italiana ma che insegna ormai da tantissimi anni a Parigi. Avremo Irene Becci, che è svizzera, è nata a Formia, ma come dire ha una ormai caratura di altissimo livello, tant'è che è la presidente della la International Society for the Sociology of Religion, quindi diciamo più di questo non si poteva pretendere. Naturalmente ci sono poi altre motivazioni collaterali, come per esempio la possibilità di proseguire lo scambio tra generazioni, non so, la mia, quella di Luca, quella di Giovanna, quella di Sara, e così via. Mi fermo qui perché la lista sarebbe ancora molto lunga. Vi faccio i migliori auguri, una notizia diciamo tecnica. Solitamente alla prima pausa caffè, quindi verso le 11, 11 e un quarto, vi chiederemo chi partecipa sia al pranzo che alla cena, perché dobbiamo comunicare ai ristoratori il numero dei partecipanti. Bene, buona SAFSOR.
It's a great honor, honor. It's a great honor for me to introduce Professor Grace Davie. And it's also something quite easy, being Professor Davie among the most famous and influent contemporary sociologists. I have also to spend only few words, and I will do it in Italian, because I suppose Mrs. Grace knows quite well her life. Allora, la professoressa Davie riceve la sua prima formazione accademica all'Università di Exeter e poi ha il PhD alla London School of Economics, e direi che questo basta e avanza. Insegna a Exeter e poi in una quantità incredibile di altri posti in giro per l'Europa e per gli Stati Uniti. Ricordo solo Uppsala, l'École des Hautes Études a Parigi e l'Hartford Seminary negli Stati Uniti. Il tema centrale del suo interesse è la sociologia della religione e i temi legati al rapporto tra religione e modernizzazione. In particolare ha fatto oggetto di studi approfonditi il rapporto tra religione e welfare, religione e questione della cura, istituzionale o non istituzionale, e più recentemente Religion and Law. È stata presidente di alcune delle più importanti istituzioni internazionali come l'American Sociology of Religion, l'International Sociology Association, con riferimento al gruppo dedicato alla religione, e altre ancora. Devo richiamare alcuni punti, e qui concludo, del suo percorso, ai quali ha fatto peraltro riferimento anche il professor Cipriani, perché nel testo che oggi ci verrà proposto c'è una sorpresa importante che raramente si verifica quando incontriamo studiosi affermati, come nel caso della professoressa Davie. Di Believing Without Belonging ha già parlato il professor Cipriani. La ricerca della professoressa è sviluppata contrapponendo all'idea di un eccezionalismo statunitense quello di un eccezionalismo europeo. La professoressa comincia studiando il caso della religione in Gran Bretagna, ma poi allarga il suo campo di ricerca a tutta l'Europa, e in questo contrapporsi da una posizione terza al nuovo paradigma e alla teoria classica della secolarizzazione riceve non solo il sostegno teoretico, ma ha poi anche modo di collaborare con un personaggio come Peter Berger, il che ancora una volta da solo dice tutto. Insieme, in dialogo con la Danielle Hervé-Leger, arrivano a formulare un altro termine che è rimasto nel linguaggio sociologico dedicato alla religione contemporaneo, che è quello della vicarious religion, della religione vicaria. Ecco, questo è il quadro, con tutte le implicazioni possibili, dal quale, sullo sfondo del quale possiamo collegare le cose che ascolteremo oggi, che appunto ci diranno qualcosa in più. Professor Grace, please. Sì.
Do I need to use it? Because this will be recorded. I do need to use it. Yeah. Thank you all for your very, very warm welcome. I'm really delighted to be here, to be in Rome again, to be with Roberto Cipriani, who I've known for many, many years, and with Luca as well. Please call me Grace if you want to talk to me. And I will call you by your first name. I'll try to get them right, try to learn them. Do come and talk to me. That's really why I've come. I very much like working with students of all ages and generations and hearing what you have to say. My apologies that I'm going to speak in English. If it's difficult to understand, you have a summary, you have the PowerPoint already. Just stop me and we'll go over it again. And when it comes to questions, ask your question in whatever language is easiest for you, and we'll find a way of dealing with it, okay? Thank you, Luca, for your introduction. I don't talk about believing without belonging very much, but I can't get away from it, so there we are. And I'm going to start today. I'm just going to tell you a little anecdote about in the summer, and then I've been back since, I went to Vienna. Now, I've been to Vienna several times, and when I go, I always visit the Museum of the History of Vienna. I find it a fascinating story and a fascinating presentation of it. This year, everybody said to me, you must go because the museum has been closed for a couple of years, and we are, the whole story, whole presentation has altered. Now it's magnificent. But I was very intrigued because one of the things that I remembered so vividly was a whole set of pictures about the siege of Vienna. When the Turks assailed the walls of Vienna, and this was Christendom against the Turk, and the big panels on the wall, and the Turk was presented as something very fantastic, very different, with different clothes, different facial features, and that was a very powerful memory for me. They've all gone. They've all gone.
the history of Vienna is still there, and Vienna was still subject to siege, but the presentation of the other was quite different. And as we worked our way to the top of the museum, and the recent history of Vienna, which was the welcoming of the immigrant, welcoming of the migrant, very largely Turkish, it was very different how we should welcome rather than repel. And they have a lot of school children in the museum in order to teach them a rather different version of their history, a different attitude. And then a week or two after I came home, what happened in the election? It was very noticeably a shift to the far right. This history is continuing. When I go back again, what will I see? And this is a little bit what I want to do with you this morning, because I want to give you some idea of how I saw the panorama of religion in Europe around 2000. And then I'm going to look one generation later, which is about now, and what has changed and how we need to think differently about it. And remember, it'll be you that writes the next chapter, not me. And it will continue. And my starting point is from, is that working? Okay, is it done? Yeah, that is the right one, yeah. Do any of you know this name, Thomas Halleck? This is very interesting because he's, if I say that in a German-speaking country or in his own country, which is the Czech Republic, everybody knows. He's beginning to be known in the UK, but clearly not yet in Italy. He's a Czech priest. He's a Catholic priest, a very remarkable man. He was ordained before 1989 in secret. He went to Germany, and it was a very risky thing to do. Now, of course, he lives as a priest. He's trained in theology, and he's trained in social science. That's what I find interesting. He has this double training. This book, which I like very much, called The Afternoon of Christianity, is published this year. And I take 2-3 quotes from it, and that will be our starting point. This is what he says: belief and unbelief are not objective realities, existing independently of the observer. They are different interpretations of the world, and they too are interpreted differently. These interpretations are primarily dependent on the observer, on their pre-understandings. They are determined by culture, language, experience, point of view, and mostly unconsidered intentions. So we need to think, what are we, each of us, bringing to the table? You have predilections, you have preconceptions, we all do. This is very similar, this quote. Questions about God and the essence of man repeatedly demand plausible, meaningful, and intelligible answers in the context of a particular culture and historical situation. You do not interpret in a vacuum. And it's that context, of course, that we're going to work on this morning. The current spiritual situation can be variously described as a decline of religion. We hear that a lot. As a crisis of faith, that's evident all around us, or of the church. A religious and spiritual renaissance. You also hear that. A return of religion in a different form. A transformation of religion into spirituality, sort of something diffuse, at the same time as a political identity, which is dangerous. A pluralization of religion, an individualization of faith, or as an opportunity for a new evangelization. The thing to grasp is they're all happening at once. This is not one story. It's a mixed story and a complex story with contradictions in it and many complexities. The other thing to hold on to is it's continually evolving. You've never finished. You have to keep going. So how can we make sense of it? Across space, across time. And I'm going to look, of course, at Europe and the evolution over a generation. This is one consolation for me for growing old, is that you see a much longer perspective. I no longer think I have answers. I have very partial answers, which will be superseded in due course. That's one reason why I get a little bit irritated if people stick with believing without belonging. I've changed, and the situation has changed, and we need new tools and new concepts all the time. I didn't give you that one, so that was the one I've just read second. I've got too many things in my hands, I'm sorry. But this is where we start. This is how it looked about 25 years ago. Okay, I was thinking about in around 2000, around the turn of the millennium. This is what I was beginning to put together. This is an article which you'll find referenced in the summary. So have any of you read it? I mean, yes. Some people. I mean, it's been quoted quite a lot. But forgive me if I go over what you might have heard before. But let's get this straight, and then we'll see what's changed. Now, when I was thinking about religion in Europe around that time, I was realizing it was, I tell my students, it's a bit like a lasagna, okay? There are many layers. It's a little bit different in this respect from America, which we thought of like a cake that you cut slices of. But we're in Europe. So one of the most important things to grasp, of course, is from Christian religion comes the way that Europeans think about time and about space. And my students look at me puzzled, and then you say, well, look, what about the week and the weekend? They don't mostly go to church or mass on a Sunday. They stay in bed on a Sunday. But why is it Sunday? Why are they not at work on a Sunday? Why is the rhythm patterned on Christian time? What about Christmas? What about Easter? What about Pentecost? And mostly they will understand Christmas. Not all of them now could tell me the story of Easter. Very few of them would know what Pentecost means. But the rhythm is still there, and often the holidays are still there. Season. It's very deep in European culture. And if you come from outside, your faith rhythm doesn't fit. You're working to Friday if you are a Muslim, or the Sabbath if you are Jewish. And it doesn't fit in the work rhythm and the work time, the times that we're expected to be at work in Europe. And space. I mean, walking through Rome is just wonderful, but Rome is just full of churches. I guess there are mosques in Rome, but they're not very visible. You could tell me where to go to find the mosque in Rome? I often think this, I've been in Prague quite recently, and if you get high up in Prague, it's a beautiful, beautiful city. Come right in, please. you look right across the old city and you see churches everywhere. And that's true all over Europe. Read your skyline. Don't read the book. Look out of the window. And what are you seeing? You are seeing the residue of a long Christian narrative. It's all around you. And in France, if you look at the parish church, of course, what do you see on the other side of the road? You see the mairie, you see the state, and you see them diametrically opposed. And that tells you an awful lot about church and state in France. You won't see that in the UK. We have a different history of church and state. So learn to read your city. Then we have an inherited model of religion, which is what I did call vicarious religion. And the important thing about this is it's territorial. We have state religions, and we have dioceses, and we have parishes. Now, the parish is a core unit of European history because it's civic as well as religious. And for centuries, people lived, worked, and died in a parish. And their records were in the parish church. And they still are in many respects. If you want to learn about the history of a place, you go and look at the church. You'd find so much of it there. You'd find a whole history of the war on the walls in terms of memorialization and that kind of thing. This is an inherited model. It's a church that you leave rather than a church that you join. Okay? It's assumed you're a member until you walk away from it. It's a public utility. It's there when you need it. It's like the National Health Service at home or a health service. You're fine with that until it's not there when you need it. And then something is missing. If the church refuses you its services at the time of a death or whatever, you take offense. You are offended. It should be there. A public utility there at the point of need for people who live in a particular place. It's a great model, but it's terribly expensive. Who is going to pay for it? We have difficulty paying for the health service. We have difficulty paying for the education services in Europe. They are public utilities. How the church is financed tells you a huge amount about a particular country's history. Always look at the money. Money talks. You'll learn a huge amount. But we have a complete network in England, but many churches do not have priests. And quite a lot are in need of repair. Who is going to pay? As you get fewer and fewer people, the money is reduced, the inheritance is still there. How do you sustain it? A shift is going on. A shift is going on because we begin to move a little bit away from the notion that the church is there historically and we are part of it, to the notion of religion as a choice. And a variety of religions are there, and you choose the one you like. That's fine. You choose what you like in shops, you choose what you like in churches. No problem with that. It's a market. And that's growing over the public utility. They are both economic models. A different way of organizing things. There's the old model, which is there at the point of need for anybody who needs it, and the new model, which is one of choice. I go if I want to. I choose what I like. I don't like this kind of religion, so I go to that kind, or to none at all. A market's great, but in a market, you have losers as well as gainers. And we need to identify who's gaining and who's losing and for what reason. It's not self-evident. And it's not, it's lying on top of the old model. I mean, in some parts of Europe, say in Sweden, you had to be a member of the church until the middle of the 19th century. It was very difficult to leave. This is why in the Nordic countries, confirmation is so important, the right of becoming an adult, which is mostly when you are 12, 13, 14. That's hugely important historically because it made you Swedish. You had to be a member of the Lutheran Church to be Swedish. And then gradually you were allowed to leave. If you did something specified, then you could just leave. But that's well into the 20th century. It's very late because it's associated with being Swedish or Danish or Norwegian. That's quite different from a Catholic model. And it's very different from the Anglican Church, which is what I know best at home. But the market grows and the choice grows, and we're beginning to live with diversity. Now, there is an extra layer of diversity or an extra element in diversity when we begin first in the post-war period, immediate post-war period. Parts of Europe were looking for labour to rebuild the economy after the war. And in Britain and in France and in what was then West Germany and in the Netherlands, you get significant in-migration from former colonies. So we have people from the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and we also have people from the West Indies and Africa. Two very distinct sources of labour. The French have people coming from North Africa, and the Germans had no empire, so they had Turkish people, and the Dutch have their variation. And that happens in the 50s, 60s. And then towards the end of the century, the 90s, that is extended. That's when migration begins in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, in Greece, and the one nearer home is Ireland, which changes very, very dramatically. In Ireland, in a very short space of time, out migration stops and in-migration starts. Ireland becomes wealthy at the end of the century. And, in Italy, you know in your own country, the story of migration here, in-migration, out-migration, is very different from the one I know. And the timing is different, but it happened. And now you, like us, talk about migration a lot. And the next change, remember I'm writing in about 2006, the article is published, is the enlargement of the European Union, and then we get enormous numbers of people moving from East Europe to West. Now, let me give you an example. In Britain, 1 million Poles came after 2004 and settled in the UK, and they were our builders and our plumbers, and a lot of vital technical work was done by Polish people. And what do? We leave the European Union, they've all gone home, and we have no plumbers. That was our fault. We'll come on to the recent period in a minute. But at the same time, even then, at the end of the century, the turn of the century, you're beginning to see the growth in the number of no religion, of nuns. It's beginning to become a noticeable feature. And the secular reactions can at times be vehement. This is the time of the new atheists. Richard Dawkins is at his zenith at this time, really, writing a lot about atheism, and it's quite aggressive. It's quite aggressive. He's changed. We'll come to him again right at the end. And the other thing I noticed is an increasing amount of attention paid to Europe as being different from the rest of the world, and I used the term exception. Now, the big problem with this was that a great deal of the thinking about religion and understanding religion came from Europe. And so off we went to everywhere else, assuming that what Europe did today, everyone else would do tomorrow. They didn't. And I've now looked again at this notion of exceptionalism, but that point is valid, that we take models from, at best, a distinctive case, and we use them on the assumption that we are secular and modern, so when everybody else is modern, they will be secular. That needs rethinking. So that's where we were in 2006. Am I going too fast, too slow, about right? Okay, you can understand. Oh, mostly anyway. Right. So, where are we now? Same factors, but I've highlighted the ones that are changing. Our cultural heritage hasn't really changed, except that the skyline, what you see if you look across the city, continues to alter. I could take you to some parts of some cities in Britain, and you would see more mosques than churches, or more gurdwaras, or whatever. One of my grandsons, who is in high school, secondary school, goes to a school, it's a very selective school in terms of ability, in Birmingham, which is the most diverse city in Western Europe. And the white boys, the English boys, are in a minority in the school as a whole. His brother goes to a school 20 miles away, different kind of lad, different kind of boy, much more artistic. And every child, almost every child in the school is white. So it can be hugely varied, but parts of our cities now are very diverse, and we have to think about that. Now, this notion of vicarious religion that I tried to explain to you, this inherited religion, this entity that works for us, is there for us, does things for us on our behalf. That's what vicarious means. In French, they use the word par procuration de. Does that translate into Italian? Vicarious is a very difficult word to translate, but if you think of the Pope as the vicar of Christ, representative, yeah. Does that work? Par procuration de, yeah, okay. But what's happened to it?
Would you like me to repeat in the microphone, or? I presume you heard me. Would you like me to repeat what I just said in the microphone?
Yeah, okay, do.
Sure.
Representation as delega. You for me. You instead me.
Yeah, okay, you get the idea, yeah. Now, what's happening to this? What's happening to this idea? What's happening? Now, the first thing I find, I am very dismayed about this, I'm not pleased at all, is that the phrase vicarious religion is entering a hugely rapidly growing literature on populism. I mean, you see, there are many other ways of talking about religion in populism, and how parts of the Christian narrative have been deployed by populists to exclude rather than include. And they use this term, vicarious religion. And so something that I felt was a part of our inheritance, that embraced people, that anybody could be a member if they lived in a particular place, that membership was assumed, is suddenly weaponized to exclude. If you are not part of this, you are not one of us. Okay? So you face your migrant with a completely different set of questions, not welcome the stranger, but are you or are you not one of us? Do you belong in this vicarious entity? And what has happened is the inheritance of faith has become an identity rather than a community of faith. It's become something that defines you as Swedish, Norwegian, English, Italian, or whatever. And so something that I thought was benign, to be honest, I didn't think it would last much longer. I know it's present in my generation as a kind of inherited idea. My children don't get it at all. They just don't think like that. Has suddenly it's come back into the literature, but in a much more negative sense. What can I do about it? It's like, toothpaste. Once you've squeezed it out of the tube, you can't put it back in. The market not only continues, but grows. It's vastly expanding. All those things I read to you from that Thomas Halleck quote right at the beginning, the choice is just endless of how you can express your faith. And now, of course, there's a whole bunch more options because you've got all the stuff you can do online. You look on the web and you can find all kinds of expressions of faith and ways of joining them that have vastly extended how you want to express this part of your life. In terms of new arrivals, the in-migration of different people, a very significant date came in 2015, and this is the war in Syria. And then we got huge numbers of people coming into Europe as refugees. And at the same time, we have a further pressure, which is going to get worse, which is the effect of climate change across, say, the Sahel in Africa, where parts of that country become uninhabitable for climatic reasons rather than persecution, except they don't come straight from there to here. They come to their neighbors, and then the pressure grows there, and the pressure comes, and that's not going to stop. And what I think is really significant about in-migration is it's politically hugely consequential. All European countries are talking about how to stop the boats, how to stop illegal migration. And this is the thing on which elections are won or lost. And it's an ugly debate. I don't think it's an unreasonable debate in many ways. I think we need to think very carefully about it. I don't think it is reasonable to absorb enormous numbers of people, but we are doing it in a profoundly negative way, and we are weaponizing our identity, our faith identity, even if we do not attend church, or even if it doesn't mean much to us. So a lot of it is directed against Islam. And if you go back to what I said about Vienna, this is not a new story in Europe. It's a very old story. The secular alternatives are growing very fast. I mean, there's no slowing down of the number of people who are becoming nuns. In parts of Europe, including Britain, there are now more people saying they have no religion or no faith than there are who say they're members. Within that category, of course, there are enormous variations. It's like a continuum. You've got very firm believers, both Muslim and Christian at one end. You've got very convinced atheists of various types at the other end. And in between, you have infinite shades of grey. This is not a black and white thing. And it's shifting sands. And my last point of change, which I think is important, is, and I've tried to alter my vocabulary, but again, I think the notion of exception has got into the discourse. I think to recognize Europe as distinctive is better than saying exceptional. And the reason I say that is exception tends to be a single exception to a homogeneous other. Whereas if you look at global religion, in fact, it's hugely varied. And so we are one variation among others. Up to now, we are the one that has become most secular. But we still have the problem that our theories and our concepts and our thinking don't apply very well elsewhere. And so we need to be a little bit cautious, a little bit modest, a little bit diffident in how we apply our thinking to other parts of the world. And we're not. Europe is used to having answers, not questions. That's a lesson to be learned. And so, if we begin to put some of this together, just as Thomas Halleck said in the quote right at the beginning, more than one thing is happening at once. If you want to grasp what is going on in the religious life of a European society, it won't be captured in a paragraph. You're going to need a lot of detail and to expect contradictory findings. It's not a straightforward, simple, one-way, done and dusted story. It's messy, ongoing, shifting, and complex. Strikingly within this mix, secularization is growing fast, much faster than I thought it would, to be quite honest. Probably more noticeable in Britain than Italy, but I'm sure you are aware of it here too. And this gives us the nuns and the people disinterested in religion, and you get a big debate about how you should teach religion in schools and all sorts of applications, how you approach people if they're in healthcare and that kind of thing. At the same time, however, religious diversity is growing exponentially. So you've got two things which are a little bit incompatible, hence Thomas Halleck pointing out the contradictions. We are becoming more secular, but at the same time we're becoming more religiously diverse. And it's this that is driving the rise in populism, this combination. Populism is often, not always, associated with conservative, somewhat intolerant forms of inherited religion. I guess you could tell me something about the Italian case if you wanted to. We could point to Hungary, where it's even more developed. Not long ago in the UK, we had appalling, very violent riots triggered by, it was a tragedy, it was a young teenager who took a knife to some children. I mean, it was awful to start with, and somebody on social media said he was a Muslim. And it was that triggered 3 or 4 weeks of considerable violence. It was very frightening to see that happening in normally quite peaceable towns in different parts of England. The goal is exclusion. Go away. You're not wanted. And the question is, the one I already articulated, are you or are you not one of us? Which, among other things, is defined by faith. And this is weaponizing Christianity. It has racist overtones as well. It's an unpleasant and very noxious cocktail. And I'm dismayed that one of the terms that I thought of to describe something rather more benign has been taken into this debate. So that's one set of issues that we need to think about. Put differently, here's another way of looking at it. And this is something where I think people like yourselves are crucially important. You are going to play a part in this debate, I hope. A positive part. Secularization not only leads to eroding religious practice and eroding belief, it also leads increasingly to an inability to comprehend what it means to be religious. There's simply an inability to speak well about religion. And you hear this in public life all the time. And if you look at social media, it's worse still. But at the same time, growing religious diversity prompts a return of religion to the public sphere, just as it is draining away from private lives. Now, there's a real paradox here, because when I learned my sociology of religion, which was in the 1960s, we learned that secularization meant that religion would no longer be resonant or relevant to public life. Healthcare, education, welfare, all became increasingly secular. That's what it meant to be modern. You were quite consciously, the London School of Economics, where I did my PhD, existed to find philosophies of science which would underpin secular welfare rather than charity from a church. This was a very conscious shift in the 60s of establishing secular codes, secular philosophies of education, healthcare, welfare, all sorts of things. Religion had no place in public life, but it was fine if people wanted to be religious. It wasn't anti-religious in the sense of undermining faith for individual people. If people wanted to be religion, that was fine. What we've got now is religion is draining from private lives, private knowledge, private thinking, private vocabulary. But what is happening to religion? It's come right back into public life as we try, not very well, to manage diversity. And that reversal over my career, to me, is very evident. And what happens? We see, day in, day out, an ill-informed and an ill-mannered debate. Not only is our information lacking, but we are profoundly rude and intolerant in our public discourse. And this is not helpful. An interesting shift in this, of course, is in the social sciences as well, which I'm not sure is so happens so much in Italy. But around the end of the century, or end of the 20th century, one of the things that happened was minorities who were previously defined in terms of ethnicity or nationality began to claim religious labels. So instead of talking about Pakistanis or Indians, you're beginning to talk about Hindus, well, Muslims and Hindus. And social science was a bit adrift on this. They were very happy to talk about ethnicity and class. They didn't particularly want to talk about religion or different kinds of religions, and yet it was the choice of the people they were studying to claim those identities. And you suddenly find a reluctance in social science to engage with what the minorities in question preferred. And I think that's an indictment of social science. And that's quite evident in Britain. And of course, what they also found was if you look at the African and West Indian migrants, they're almost all Christian, and far more Christian than most English people. And so you get huge sort of new narratives of Christianity, but coming in from outside. And this is very perplexing as well, because and one of the things that happens here is a great confusion about colonization and decolonialization, because it's very fashionable to decry colonization and decolonialize your curriculum, your thinking, your teaching, and all this kind of thing. And yet when those people coming from the colonies want to talk about religion, you suddenly go back to your instinct of thinking you are superior, thinking you are European, and rejecting precisely what these people are asking for. There's many paradoxes in this. The political implication, the policy and political implications are huge at the moment. You know that. In migration, religious diversity, presence of Islam are matters of great difficulty in European society. We are not handling this at all well. And it's consequential for elections. Election results are determined by these things. And so the workplace, education, there's so many aspects of our societies need careful thinking. This is why you're here. You are learning to speak well of these things and be properly informed in whatever walk of life you come from. And if you're a teacher, you are training students who is the next generation to debate these things. It's a big job. Good luck to you all. A partial exception. I think this is interesting. That is the one about international relations, isn't it? The political scientists are doing better than we are. Well, maybe some of you are political scientists, but on the whole, international relations is catching up. I've just given you one example from my own university, who happens to be Italian. That's a fortunate coincidence. That's nice. Gregorio Betizza. So some of what he writes is in Italian, so there you go. And he writes about a new world order. And he writes about the soft power of faiths. Think of India. Think of Iran. Think of China, which of course is the secular option. Think of the US and what's just happened in the election. Think of Russia and the, I would say, the misuse of orthodoxy in the notion of the Russian world. You cannot understand 21st century international relations if you ignore religion. You just can't. Think of the war in Ukraine. Think of the Middle East. And I would not say that any of them are caused by religion. They're multi-causal. They're territorial disputes. They are political disputes. They are power struggles. But because religion is an integral factor in both of those, it means they are much more difficult to resolve. Partly because we understand the religious factor badly, and partly because the stakes are higher. Once the religious narrative enters a power struggle, it's always more difficult to resolve because the claims are bigger. But my colleagues in political science, I think, are heading in the right direction. It's time I stopped. I'm going to end with two questions. I told you we would return to Richard Dawkins. We noticed the growth in the number of nuns, and they get very upset when they see religion coming back to public life, as it does in the management of diversity. They would prefer that we had secular norms to deal with secular issues. Life, I'm afraid, is more complicated, isn't like that. The French Olympic Games was very, very interesting for many of us in what was permitted in terms of religion in the presentation and what was excluded. So you were allowed a certain license in the presentation of Christianity, which offended some Catholics. You were not, on the whole, the French team were not allowed to wear a hijab or anything like that, but their visitors were. So it's a curious shifting mix, very good for teaching, to look at some of the images that come from the Olympic Games in France and ask what is allowed and what is not allowed. But within all this mix and things going on, we find a number of prominent atheists thinking, or at least speaking, differently. Now, Richard Dawkins styles himself a cultural Christian. And what does he mean by cultural Christian? I think I know what he means. He means anti-Islam. I may be wrong. I hope I'm not maligning him, but I think it's a defense of a Christian, what he sees as a Christian way of living, which he prefers to what he perceives as the Islamic world. I think both perceptions are probably inaccurate or not helpful. But he more than once has claimed, I'm a cultural Christian. Look them up, you'll find them on the web. Think about it. What does this mean? Do you know the name Ayaan Hirsi Ali? Do you know who she is? She became very well known because do you remember the episode with Theo van Gogh, who was murdered in the Netherlands for presenting a film that had images on it that were very offensive to Islam. Now, Hirsi Ali was complicit in that. She was in the film. They wrote all sorts of Muslim things that Muslims would find very difficult on a woman's body, and it was her body. She is now an evangelical Christian living in the US. Now I didn't expect that to happen. She's an individual. She has, she's free to choose what she likes. It's all I'm asking you is, how would you interpret that? It's a question. I don't really know the answer. I'm thinking. But it's a noticeable shift and an unexpected one. I mean, I quite like it when unexpected things happen. It means we haven't got the whole thing sorted. It means we have to think again. And it can sometimes be awful, a horrible surprise. Sometimes it can be quite encouraging. You never quite know which. I can't quite place that one, to be honest, but it's just somewhere to end to think about it. And then I have one more question, which has come to me very recently. And I don't have all the answers. I can suggest to you my thinking, my ways of looking at things, how I think things have changed. I'm not necessarily right, and I'm looking forward to seeing how you respond. But I've just come across these authors here. The top two are Swedish, but they write in English. I think they live in England too. And then the next, and they're really a pair of books. The second book is a commentary on the first. But they both ask the same question, and the question is this. It's become quite widespread now for mainstream Christians, I am going to say Christians in this way, the mainstream of the inherited churches, who look at the representations of Christianity by the far right. I heard Helen Painter speaking not long ago, and she had a very, very powerful film. It was very disturbing, of somebody dressed as a Christian. I mean, he had a dog collar and he looked like a bishop. He wasn't a bishop as I would recognize, but he looked like one. And he really ranted about migrants and Islam. It wasn't violent in the sense of physical violence, but it was verbal violence, and it was very strong. And her question was, is the mainstream responsible for that? Or does it simply say that's not right? What is the attitude of the mainstream to these extreme representations of Christianity? Sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, more often on the right. And I just give you one example from a couple of things I've noticed said already. Of course, it is fine for somebody who calls himself a Christian, who is a member of a Christian church, to vote Brexit. That's a perfectly legal position. It was a democratic, it was a referendum, there was no pressure, people voted as they wished, and Christian people voted Brexit. That's fine. When it comes to setting fire to hotels who are housing migrants because of your dislike of Islam, which was part of what Brexit was about as well. It was protecting borders. You can't condone that. That's illegal. That's violent. That's threatening life. But where do you draw the line? And what is the attitude of the mainstream to the extreme? It's exactly the same question as is faced by middle-of-the-road, conservative political parties. Do they make an alliance with the far right to keep out the left? Or do they stay in the center or move to the left to exclude the right? You'll have different positions in terms of your attachment to faith communities. That's not what this seminar is about. But I do think that it's a very interesting question as to whether the mainstream has any responsibility for the extremes, and what do we do about it if we accept that responsibility? One of the things you do, and I think this is quite clear, is you try to understand the attitudes and fears and rationale of those who vote for the far right. Why are they doing it? And that's a demanding thing to do, but I think it's a responsible thing to do. And it's not easy, and you'll meet some people who will disturb you, but I still think that's a good question to ask, is why they're taking that position. Anyway, that's where I end. I started with Thomas Halleck. We looked at what I thought happened in 2000, at the recent changes, some of which are disturbing, and the consequences. And I ask you now to tell me what you think, and to remember to realize the responsibilities you have, particularly if you are teaching, to get people to think clearly and accurately about the religious dimension of their own societies. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Grace, for your very, very interesting presentation. Io chiedo a voi se ci sono subito degli interventi, prego.
Vi riassumo quello, ho visto che siete bravissimi in inglese, dietro, tutti quanti facevano sì, io giusto mi prendo Vi prendo un secondo di tempo per ricordarvi quello che è stato detto per veramente sommi capi, tanto so che voi avete colto il tutto in modo da favorire il dibattito. Allora, siamo partiti, riassumo molto brevemente, alcune cose le lascerò fuori, siamo partiti dal fatto che abbiamo delle premesse e dei preconcetti, tutti noi, di tipo culturale e storico, che orientano e organizzano il nostro rapporto con la religione. Chiaramente lavoreremo, ha detto la professoressa, proprio su questo aspetto qui. E quindi siamo andati a guardare come in qualche modo molti aspetti che spesso non facciamo rientrare, aspetti economici, la professoressa diceva seguite i soldi, molto spesso questo ci permette di capire come si muovono. Quindi c'è indubbiamente una crisi della fede, ma anche un ritorno alla religione sotto forma di spiritualità. Soprattutto c'è una pluralità, okay, di professioni religiose e come abbiamo visto verso la fine c'è una grande difficoltà diciamo in qualche modo ad accettare le diversità, e le diversità sono tante e le piattaforme digitali e i media contribuiscono a stressare o comunque a favorire questo tipo di partecipazione. Se leggiamo queste dimensioni nel tempo e nello spazio e se teniamo conto dell'evoluzione intergenerazionale, dobbiamo vedere come era possibile concettualizzare. La professoressa mette 2 punti fermi. Un articolo che lei scrive nel 2006 in cui rappresenta, diceva, no? L'Europa come una lasagna, come se esistessero tanti strati, confrontando con l'America come se fosse una torta in cui possiamo dividere tanti spicchi, no? Con una rappresentazione diversa del rapporto con la religione. In questo senso, quindi, per esempio possiamo riflettere come le nostre pause di lavoro, il Natale, ma anche la Pentecoste, la Pasqua, la Domenica, quanto siamo ancora in grado di mantenere un rapporto tra quelli che sono i tempi e i ritmi delle nostre ritualità con un significato all'interno di queste ritualità, o se in alcuni casi l'hanno persa, cioè non siamo più in grado di ricostruirle. E qui quindi c'è anche una questione che si solleva, il fatto della nostra appartenenza e del nostro credo. Si può credere e non appartenere e appartenere e credere, e queste 2 cose non necessariamente vanno nello stesso senso. Quindi c'è una trasformazione, la religione è una scelta in alcuni casi, proprio per questo aumento delle diversità, e noi scegliamo ciò che ci piace. Questo è un modello, ma è anche un modello economico, cioè ha un impatto dal punto di vista economico. L'altra possibilità è che noi, per esempio come italiani, nasciamo all'interno di una nazione in cui siamo per definizione cristiani. Non so come posso dire, la Chiesa sta lì, è a disposizione. Non dobbiamo pensare se ci apparteniamo, non è una scelta, possiamo uscirne per scelta. Ma anche questo è un modello economico. Chi paga per questo tipo di servizi in qualche modo? No? Ci sono tanti servizi di cui abbiamo bisogno, diceva la professoressa, i servizi sanitari, i servizi sociali. In più dobbiamo tenere conto quelli che è stato, diciamo, un esempio, per esempio, era che in Svezia a metà del Novecento dovevi fare parte di una comunità cristiana, non avevi scelta, essere fuori diciamo, non essere luterano, non essere associato, era un problema poi vivere. Oggi è molto tardi, fa notare, si può anche non appartenere, quando prima era in qualche modo una forma di obbligo per poter avere una vita sociale. Poi abbiamo visto che in qualche modo con diciamo, la ricostruzione del dopoguerra molti dei paesi coloniali hanno diciamo, visto un forte impatto immigratorio da parte delle loro colonie. Parlavamo di Francia, Germania e Olanda, la Francia dall'Africa, la Germania dalla Turchia, l'Olanda un mix, ma come questo aspetto poi ha fortemente influito sul tessuto e quindi sulle pratiche religiose. Poi c'è stata una successiva migrazione da parte di paesi come la Spagna, il Portogallo, ma anche l'Italia verso, diciamo, verso il nord. Attualmente si è assistito in una seconda fase una migrazione da parte dell'est, cioè se ci pensate Lei diceva idraulici, carpentieri, muratori, vengono dall'est, ma questo è vero anche in Italia in realtà, cioè vengono a costituire un aspetto importante del tessuto lavorativo all'interno di un paese, che poi però influisce perché le persone si stabilizzano e quindi appartengono e quindi vivono le loro fedi. C'è sicuramente un incremento dell'ateismo, un disinteresse, e qui ci fermiamo all'articolo del 2006. Se andiamo oltre e poniamo una serie di questioni, possiamo guardare a come l'eredità culturale ha cambiato e continuamente si trasforma, cioè noi abbiamo un'eredità, ma questa dimensione è in continua trasformazione e va a influire sul tessuto religioso, sul modo con cui noi istituiamo l'appartenenza e definiamo la nostra identità. Diciamo, stringo in modo che possiate aprire il dibattito. Fondamentalmente mi sembra di poter individuare alcuni aspetti importanti. Sottolineava che le ultime campagne elettorali, io segnalerei più o meno dal 1917, 1916 anche, hanno ruotato fortemente sulla dimensione migratoria, cioè si vincono o si perdono le campagne elettorali in ragione del tema della migrazione. Diciamo, quindi questo aumento, incremento delle possibilità religiose, ma anche incremento della diversità, ma anche incremento della difficoltà a accettare la diversità, e un ritorno, lei diceva, alla secolarizzazione, cioè a un tentativo di una maggioranza di escludere un'eccezionalità, mettiamola così, un'eccezione, un rapporto, se vogliamo, tra minoranze e maggioranze, che spesso a livello politico può essere trattato con un linguaggio estremamente rude, ma anche scorretto, offensivo, e come questi aspetti poi in realtà vanno a in qualche modo organizzare la vita politica. Un'ultima cosa, salto molte delle cose che sono state dette, ma mi affido a voi, un'ultima cosa che sottolineava era proprio questo aspetto che apparentemente poneva una serie di questioni verso la fine, no? Una di queste è, per esempio, come mai l'estrema destra sembra avvicinarsi nei costumi, nelle immagini, ma anche nel linguaggio, a una dimensione di cristianità, d'accordo? E come in realtà quale possa essere il rapporto tra la maggioranza e, se volete, le minoranze nella rappresentazione, cioè quando l'estrema destra pone una serie di questioni anche molto offensive, che cosa fa la maggioranza, come si posiziona, non tanto per dare una risposta, diceva la professoressa Davis, ma per provare a sollevare delle questioni critiche, anche perché noi come, diciamo, educatori abbiamo delle come si dice, responsabilità importanti, perché siamo coloro che possiamo, come noi stiamo facendo in questo momento, venendo a sentire la professoressa Davis, acquisire delle categorie utili per poter pensare e per poter, diciamo, favorire l'educazione delle generazioni future.
Grazie per la sintesi e per la traduzione. Chiedo a voi se ci sono subito degli interventi. Okay, I have 3 questions for Professor Davie. Each of 3 questions started from the sentence I found crucial in your presentation. This is the quotation. Continuing secularization leads inexorably to an inability to comprehend what it means to be religious. At the same time, growing religious diversity prompts a return of religion to the public space. Briefly, there is an increasing religion and a decreasing religion at the same time. First question, which is the idea of religion embedded in the secularization process that make us impossible, or at least dramatically difficult, to detect and define the kind of religion that, on the contrary, is returning within the public space, but also changing this. I think is absolutely correct using the same concept, religion, in both cases, but it needs to distinguish historically and geographically determined variants of religion. About the two religions, the two kinds of religion, the declining and the increasing ones, might we say something of more precise other than the deep difference in terms of beliefs and attendance? Second question. Looking at the current landscape of the social and sociological theories, what of these could be more useful? Which of these could be more useful in carrying on the task of distinguishing which religion is declining and which is booming? Third and last, I think that in order to answer both questions, we should reconsider more closely the question about rituals, religious rituals, and different kinds of religious rituals. What do you think about it? In breve, in italiano, a me ha colpito molto una frase presente nel presentation della professoressa nell'abstract, dove si diceva che la secolarizzazione progressiva ci rende inesorabilmente incapaci di comprendere cosa significa religione e nello stesso tempo assistiamo a una crescente diversità religiosa che torna nello spazio pubblico e tra l'altro lo cambia. Su questo io ponevo tre questioni. La prima è quella di un qualche elemento di definizione, nel senso che io sono assolutamente convinto della correttezza di chiamare religione l'una e l'altra, però dobbiamo essere in grado di distinguerle un po', in termini teoretici ovviamente, altrimenti non riusciamo a costruire gli indicatori che ci mettono in considerazione di testare queste ipotesi. Secondo, è una domanda di teoria sociale o teoria sociologica, quale delle tante offerte teoriche che oggi abbiamo sul mercato sociologico la professoressa trova più utile per mettere a fuoco l'oggetto che sta studiando, e terza questione, se per tutte e due le precedenti non risultasse utile una maggiore attenzione, qui non ne abbiamo parlato, al rito, che non è solo religioso, al rito religioso e al tipo di rito religioso, perché ne esistono diversi. Ecco, queste erano le mie tre questioni, non so se abbiamo altre domande, se no possiamo chiedere di partire da qui. Ok, can we start with these three questions?
Well,
tre opzioni che lei ha. Mi sorgeva un dubbio, anzi più di uno per la verità, su alcune parti. Se fosse vero questo, mi ero sottolineato lo stesso rigo sulla secolarizzazione, allora mi chiedo, una diffusione così ampia e profonda della secolarizzazione sarebbe in grado di distorcere anche le credenze? Allora mi chiedo, se la secolarizzazione, lo diceva già Ulrich Beck, ma non è l'unico, è in profonda crisi, per me è in profonda crisi, come è in profonda crisi il pensiero laico, il pensiero illuministico, che non butterei del tutto a mare, allora mi chiedo, in cosa incide, perché non si può dare la colpa alla secolarizzazione, qual è la forza di incidenza della secolarizzazione nel provocare delle risposte come dire, di arretramento delle proprie credenze. Non so se... perché questo è un problema serio, secondo me.
Okay. We've got...
Mi riallaccio alle due domande precedenti che si completano. E quindi colgo l'occasione, prima di tutto, per ringraziarlo per l'intervento straordinario. Ma io che vivo in Francia, non funziona, sì. Io che vivo in Francia mi rendo conto che effettivamente c'è e ne parlerò, una crisi della laicité, che è più forte della secolarizzazione. E la laicité è proprio uno dei valori fondamentali della Repubblica Francese. Il quarto, libertà, egalità, fraternità, laicité. Allora, più largamente in Europa, perché questo è un problema strettamente europeo, da dove viene questa crisi di un elemento fondamentale, non parlo di identità europea, la parola mi piace, ma di quello che noi siamo anche da decenni, se non secoli. Cioè, e non vorrei dire semplicemente perché c'è il ritorno della religione, perché il ritorno della religione non spiega niente, anzi deve essere spiegato. E di quale religione? E quindi, secondo lei, cosa ha incrinato, cosa ha messo nell'angolino questo elemento fondamentale che è quello della nostra concezione dello spazio pubblico, da credenti e non credenti? Grazie.
Okay. That's enough for the moment, okay? I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased that you picked up the key of the whole thing, which is the coming together of accelerating secularization. Come to laicité in a minute, and at the same time as diversity is growing at presenting challenges to the secular society. That's where we are living in Europe at the moment. And what you find in the literature is either studies of secularization or studies of diversity. You don't see them put alongside each other. And this is what I've tried to do. That I really do think this is the critical thing that you need to grasp in 2025. Okay, we'll look forwards. It starts in about, well, I would say 2016, 17 is crucial because that's when diversity accelerates. And this time, if you look at the earlier flows of immigration, they rise and they fall. They usually fall because of an economic recession, because it's not worth coming. There are no jobs to come to. And 2008 means they drop down. But I don't think they're going to fall, nor does anybody in political life think that. So this is ongoing, difficult, demanding, and at the same time, we are losing the vocabulary, we're losing the sensitivities, we're losing the capacity to talk well about religion. Turn on your radio, turn on your television, listen to debate over the dinner table or in the public space, and you can. And not only is it the kind of offensive language of a certain kind of far-right person, you imagine civil servants in government framing legislation about migration, and they can't do it because they don't know how to speak well about religion. You imagine people in the Foreign Office trying to make policy in terms of the Middle East or wherever they don't have the information, the sensitivities, the capacity to do it, because they've lost the vocabulary, they've lost the sensitivity. The legal output or the policy output is often inadequate, precisely because of this. That's what's happening now. That's why the debate is ill-informed and ill-mannered. And I think that's indisputable. How do we get out of the problem? That's the trouble. I said this before, I think the political scientists, particularly international relations specialists, are leading the way, because they've at least grasped the problem rather than ignoring it. Now, I think you ought to talk more about why rituals is the place to look. But I think you are absolutely right in saying that the kind of religion that we're losing is different from the one that we're gaining. And there's a mismatch there, and there's also a mismatch in the social scientific understanding. You know, this is the challenge of your generation. I know you're mixed in generation, but this is the challenge of those going into teaching in the university now. This is what you've got to get your minds around. And, you know, it's a long time since I've been teaching now on a regular basis, but I never had any difficulty attracting students to the class. They wanted to know, but they brought very little knowledge into the classroom. You were starting on a very low base. And do look at your school system of you know, what are children, students, being taught in the classroom. I think that good teachers of religious education are the most important people in our society. Some of them are excellent, and some of them are the ones who find it hard. I don't think it's always their fault. They are people who trained in another specialism, and they've been asked to take this class because nobody else can do it. And that is not at all satisfactory. That's something to look at, the training of teachers in the field. Why is secularization reversing amongst some people? I don't know. Well, I do know. I think it's because, well, I think are you thinking about individuals changing their opinions, or are you talking about trend? Individuals, more about individuals. Well, I'm sorry to say, ask them. I think it's very interesting. I mean, Richard Dawkins and Hirsi Ali are still quite articulate, and they still write and publish, so you can look and see what they're saying. Richard Dawkins has just published a new book, which I haven't read, to be honest. Watch this space. We need to learn more about what's happening. This is pretty new. Keep an eye on it, and look on the, you know, sometimes when you hear a presentation like this, or you meet with colleagues like this, something triggers in your mind, and then you go back to your sources and things you didn't see before. And I think that's where you begin. You start building a profile of what they've said and when and why. But I don't know the answer to that. Laïcité is, laïcité is very, very perplexing to anybody who is not French or Belgian. I mean, we try hard, we really do. But for example, again, when I was teaching, and I would try to explain in a French school, you can't wear the veil. And the students would say, why not? I went to school and my friends wore veils. What's wrong with that? And then you try to say, well, in, you know, the history of France and all the things that happened, and this notion is so quintessentially French. But I do understand that it's in the same, much more public space than the private opinion, and we need to take them together. We need to consider the crisis in public space as well as the changes in opinion of individuals. Because even in France, you have to manage diversity. Not easy for any of us, but I think you have a particular set of attitudes and concepts with which to approach the subject, which are particular to the French case. And I mean, you have, I mean, we're talking about it again because of the court case of the terrible murder of the teacher in yeah, which, I mean, shocked us all. But I think it was almost a year later we had a member of parliament stabbed and died. You know, nobody's better than anyone else. You just bring a particular repertoire to the subject, which is distinctly French. But I was very intrigued watching the Olympics from this point of view. And the French, you know, the French did an amazing job on the Olympics. I mean, it was a hugely successful event. And yet this question was in the debate, in round the edges. And I found that very fascinating. Can we have some coffee? Is my question.
Il problema dovremmo interrogarci anche in maniera un po' più operativa, utilizzando però degli elementi non solo statici, ma dinamici nel tempo. Allora probabilmente una delle cose su cui dovremmo riflettere è che cos'è la sfera pubblica oggi e quanto si è privatizzata la sfera pubblica, come si sono privatizzate le diverse sfere di ingerenza sociali nella società. Questo è un problema serio, perché noi diciamo sì, sfera pubblica, agire pubblico, ma esattamente in una situazione pluriculturale che cosa significa oggi? Perché è parte di un processo di privatizzazione delle esperienze, come poi cercherò di dire, ma che sono regolate da un principio ben preciso, che è quello della separazione delle sfere della vita dell'economia capitalistica. Se noi non partiamo da tutto questo, come dire, lo lasciamo in una sorta di empireo che però non riusciamo a rendere concreto ed empiricamente rilevabile. Questo è il punto. Poi ci apriremo su questo.
Questa più che una domanda era un'osservazione che ha contribuito alla riflessione. Altre questioni o altro caffè? Mi pare che siamo per il caffè. Thanks a lot to Professor Grace.